بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين وعلى جميع إخوانه من النبيين والمرسلين وآل كل وصحب كل ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. All praise is due to Allah, and may Allah raise the rank of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and protect his nation from that which he fears for them. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase our knowledge and benefit us with the knowledge we have acquired. Ameen. Let us first have the proper intention, our hearts, to attend the lesson for the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are still talking about the chapter of dealings and transactions as per the book known as Al-Ghaya wa Taqrib, authored by a great Shafi'i Imam known as Al-Qadi Abu Shuja', may Allah raise his rank. We're up to the chapter about lending items or articles. It happens that a person might be in need of borrowing something of someone to achieve a task. You might borrow a saw, for instance, to cut a piece of wood. And someone might come to you as well, asking to borrow something, and you might lend him. Now, one has to be aware of the rules pertaining to this type of dealing, because it happens that the article or the item might get wrecked while in use. In that case, who is liable Islamically for reimbursement? Would the borrower in that case be liable for reimbursement or not? Also, the borrower, can he lend it to someone else? Can lending an article or borrowing an article be restricted to a time, or to be infinite duration of time, meaning without limitation? All these matters are discussed in this chapter. So one would be aware of the situation, and he would know if he is entitled for reimbursement or not. Otherwise, dispute might arise because people are unaware of these rules pertaining to this dealing. Al-Qadi Abu Shuja' said, it is permissible to lend anything that can be benefited from as long as the entity itself is not consumed and the designated benefit is an effect, not an entity. We're going to talk about it. It is permissible to lend something with or without restricting its duration of usage. The borrower is liable to reimburse its value on the day of its ruin. So with these few lines, he summarized, because we told you this is a summary. He summarized the rules pertaining to lending articles or borrowing articles. It depends on which part you are playing in this manner, as the lender or as the borrower. This is called in Arabic al-ariyah, borrowing or lending an article. Islamically, it is a type of dealing where one allows the other party to benefit from using this item with the condition that this item is not consumed. Keep that in mind. So in order for one to be allowed to borrow something, that thing, whether it is an item, article, something like this, it should not be consumed in using that item. For instance, a person cannot borrow a candle because the candle will be consumed. One cannot borrow food and drink because that will be consumed as well. Some people, they have a habit, if they run out of bread in some regions, they send a person to the neighbors who would tell them, can we borrow 3 loaves, for instance? You cannot borrow food because you are not going to return them. You are going to consume them. So lending here, we're not talking about debt as when you borrow something as in a debt, because as a debt one can borrow as a debt a loaf of bread and he will return something similar to it. That's called lending, like when you borrow money of someone. So I don't want you to get confused between the two terms. When you borrow money of someone, let us say you borrow 100 and then you return the 100. Of course, you're not going to return the exact 100. You're going to use it. Then you're going to pay a replacement for that 100. That's fine. That's called in lending as a debt. Here we're not talking about this type of dealing that is called al-qard. Qard. It's like a debt. Here we are talking now about lending an article so you can benefit by it, use it, and benefit by it, then you return it. That's our topic. Like you borrow a saw, you borrow a bicycle, you borrow a car of your friend, you go to a place, then you come back. This is what we are talking about. So you don't pay money in return. So you're not hiring this article. You're not hiring, and you are not borrowing as a debt. Here we are talking about one allowing another person to use his item to benefit by it, and later on he would return the article and it won't be consumed. This is called al-ariyah. When one would lend something to another person to benefit by its usage, then he can return it without consuming it. So that's a condition. When we say without that article being consumed, we exclude here all what is consumed, such as food, drink, candles. Those cannot be borrowed in this concept that we are talking about. So Islamically, this is a definition of it: allowing one to benefit by the usage of an article without this article being consumed. So you are allowing what they call the right of usage. The right of usage. To use that item in something permissible, then you return it without this article being consumed. This is the topic we're going to talk about. So Al-Qadi Abu Shuja' said, it is permissible When he said it is permissible, it's not a binding contract. It's permissible. I can lend you something to use. Let us say you want to borrow my bicycle. You're going to go buy something and come back. Then I say, okay, you can take it. Then once you took it, then I say, hold on, I changed my mind. Bring it back. Here you cannot say, no, you told me I can use it. There is no binding contract here. Because it's not a binding contract, you understand from this that this agreement will be nullified automatically if the lender dies. If one of them dies, or the borrower dies, or one becomes insane, or one loses consciousness, because it's not a binding contract, it becomes nullified. So if someone borrows something of a person, then he dies, and he did not assign a time for using this article, he was using it. If he knows that the owner of this article has passed away, then he needs to return it to the inheritors. Because this contract is not a binding contract. So it gets nullified, dismissed, once one dies or becomes insane or loses consciousness. So he said it is permissible. We know now what's the meaning of permissible. It's not a binding contract. To lend anything that can be benefited from. So it has a benefit. When we say it has a benefit, that means you cannot lend something that doesn't have a benefit. Such as the scholars give an example. The extremely sick donkey. Extremely sick donkey with a sickness that it's not hoped for this donkey to be recovered from. It's like paralyzed donkey, for instance. What benefit you can get from it? Nothing. So lending such an article in this case is not valid. So it should have a benefit that can be benefited from as long as the entity itself is not consumed. So if it will be consumed by usage, then you cannot lend it. Like a candle, like food and drink. This cannot be obtained through borrowing. Now this type of dealing is taken from the Quran, the Hadith, and the scholarly consensus. From the Quran, Allah Ta'ala said, وَيَمْنَعُونَ الْمَاعُونَ وَيَمْنَعُونَ الْمَاعُونَ. Al-Ruyani, one of the scholars, said, at the beginning of the revelation, when the Prophet received the revelation, it was a must upon the one to lend if he was asked to lend something. Al-Bukhari said, وَيَمْنَعُونَ الْمَاعُونَ. What goes under the word al-ma'un? Any goodness. Any goodness, any act, there is an act of goodness, one should not refuse offering the act of goodness. Or if there is something, by offering this, one will be rewarded, he shouldn't refuse lending such a thing to the one who is asking, to the borrower. From the hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam borrowed a horse from Abi Talha to use it. So he borrowed the horse to use it. That shows that this dealing is acceptable in our religion. You can borrow something. The horse will be returned as a horse. So it won't be consumed. So what's the benefit that one can obtain from a horse? Riding the horse. So riding is not an entity. Riding is an effect. You might say, meaning the usage. You are not consuming the horse, you are obtaining a benefit by using that horse. So that benefit is not an entity. That's the meaning of the saying of Al-Qadi Abu Shuja', Athar. Athar, not entities. Not entities. So that's a condition. So after you have learned that this type of dealing, lending an article, borrowing an article, is something legitimized in our religion. It's in the Quran, in the Hadith, and by the scholarly consensus. And you know that it has conditions. In order for such a dealing to be lawful, to be valid, now we talk about these conditions. First of all, the lender must be entitled to make such a permission. He must be entitled to make such a permission. That excludes the one, as we mentioned before, debarred from conducting any financial transaction. We told you a person might be overloaded with debts, that he won't be able to pay the debts back, and the judge might impose debarment against him, meaning he will debar him. He will not let him transact in any financial transaction because his money now is frozen, so those that he owes the money can take the money from his properties. This person that is debarred from making such a transaction cannot lend an item to someone. Also, he is not a child. The child cannot have this type of permission for others to use something that is for him. He's a child. So he must be entitled to give that permission. When we say this, that means he must be the owner. That's another thing. So not only pubescent and sane, and he's not debarred from making such transactions, he's also the owner. When we say the owner, keep that in mind. If I borrow something of someone, I'm not the owner. I'm allowed by the owner to use it in a permissible way, then return it back to him. So I'm not the owner. Because I'm not the owner, I cannot permit someone else to benefit by it without the permission of the owner. So not because he lent it to you, that means you go and lend it to others. It's not up to you. That decision is not up to you. You were allowed by the owner to use it in that permissible way. You do not own the benefit. You are allowed to use that benefit, but you do not own it. Why we mention this? To differentiate between borrowing an item or renting an item. When I rent a car, I now own the benefit, not the car. I own the benefit. I rented this car out from someone. I own the benefit now. I can give it to someone else to drive it. I can lend it to others because I own the benefit. If I borrow something, just borrowing, I do not own the benefit in that case. Rather, I'm permitted to benefit from this article without owning that benefit. Is that understandable? There's a difference between them. If I rent a house, for instance, I rent for 6 months, and we made a contract, and renting is a binding contract. When I rent the house, I own the benefit. Because I own the benefit, I can now rent a room for someone else. I can lease it out to someone. I want to lease you one room for 6 months. I own the benefit. But if one allowed me to use his house, I do not own that benefit. I'm permitted to benefit from this item, but I do not own the benefit. See the difference between them? So that's one condition. The owner is allowing the borrower to benefit by this article without this article being consumed. So in one case, for instance, or to give some examples, can one borrow a horse? Yes, he can. Can one borrow a camel? Yes, he can. Can one borrow a car? Yes, he can. Can one borrow shampoo? He can't. It will be consumed. Can one borrow a soap? He can't. It will be consumed. Can one borrow a candle? He can't, because it is consumed. Can one borrow bread or drink? He can't, because it will be consumed. So this is what we are going to talk about. So he said the benefit must not be consuming the item. They give an example. If one were to lend another person a sheep for the milk in it, or to lend him the tree for the fruits on it. Now basically he's going to consume the fruits, and he's going to consume the milk in it. What's the judgment in that case? The scholars held two opinions regarding this case. They said, if one says to another person, take this sheep and I allow you to take its milk, they said in that case one cannot borrow the milk. So that kind of donation in that case is classified as invalid, and the sheep remains liable for reimbursement. We're going to talk about this. Liable for reimbursement, although the way one borrowed this sheep was in an invalid way, still classified as liable for reimbursement. Another saying says borrowing the sheep is valid. You can borrow a sheep. So borrowing the sheep is valid, and if one were to allow one to take the milk, it's like donation, and in that case they allowed such a manner in that case. Then he talks about another thing. He says it is permissible to lend something with or without restricting its duration of usage. That means if one were to lend someone something, a car, to use it, he can say, I permit you to use it for 1 week. He might say, I permit you to use it for a month. Or he might say, I give you permission to use it, without specifying a duration of time. So it can be lent with and without restricting the duration of its usage. Then he says, the borrower is liable to reimburse its value on the day of its ruin. That means the borrowed item, if it is used in something that the borrower is not allowed to use it in it, and due to that use it gets ruined, then he must reimburse its value to the owner. Let us say someone said, I want to borrow your camel to ride it to that place and come back. So he allowed him to ride it. He went to that place, then he put the furniture on it on the way back. So he's not permitted to use it in that way. And because he put the furniture on it, it died. He, as a borrower, is liable for reimbursement. He used it in a way that he's not permitted to use it in it. Someone might go to his neighbor and borrow the iron to iron his clothes. So he lent him the iron to iron his clothes. But this person chose to build a shed using this iron as a hammer. And he smashed it. Here he used it in a way that he is not permitted to, and he needs to reimburse in that case the value of it. However, if he used it in the permitted way, let us say clothes. You might, let us say, a friend of yours might say, I want to borrow this t-shirt from you. Then you lent him without specifying a duration of time. And he kept on wearing it. Of course, along the time, what's going to happen to it? The signs of the wear will be shown on it. So it won't be like new. The signs of wear will be on it. In that case, he does not reimburse. He used it in what he is permitted to. That's number one. And its color faded away because of the use. In that case, he's not classified as negligent in using that t-shirt. But imagine, for instance, thinner, you know the thinner? They use it for paint. Fell on the floor and he grabbed this t-shirt and he cleaned the floor with the thinner. Then after that it became, it started getting ripped because it burns it. Here, that is classified as negligence from his side. Then he is liable to reimburse its value. So anything that will attribute the borrower to negligence, the borrower becomes liable to reimburse its value. That's something you keep in mind. If there was nothing from any sign of negligence, he used it as he was permitted, but it died. It died. He borrowed a horse. As he walked away, his lifespan ended. It coincided that after he took it, its lifespan ended. So there was no negligence from his side. Then in that case, he is not liable for reimbursement. But if there is shortage in his side, negligence in his side, then he needs to reimburse her. By this we conclude talking about lending an article or borrowing an article. That's in a very simple way. And inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala will continue the rest in the future lessons. And Allah knows best. We say La ilaha illallah and we make salah on the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam.